1 pot, 1 ring, 11 pence. And somehow she fed 7 people from it. Number 22 on this list did exactly that in 1953. And the woman who made it never once wrote it down. Number 11 was so good for you that post-war health visitors in Birmingham recommended it by name to struggling families. And it vanished from British kitchens within 20 years. And number 1, the 1-pot meal that sat on more British stoves than any other from the 1940s through to the 1970s. Your grandparents made it every single week. The generation after yours has never once attempted it. These are 25 forgotten poor man 1-pot meals British grandparents made to survive. And if your nan had a pot that lived permanently on that stove, this one is for her. Number 25. Dripping broth. Close your eyes. You're in a kitchen that smells of yesterday. The pot on the back ring has been there since Tuesday. It started as the water the potatoes were boiled in, then the carrot went in, then a heel of bread, then whatever was left in the dripping tin, the dark, savoury jelly from the bottom, the stuff that tasted of every roast and rasher, salt, white pepper if there was any, left on the lowest possible heat until it reduced down into something thick and dark. That was neither quite soup nor quite stew, but fed you better than either. In the back-to-back houses of Leeds and Bradford in 1952, dripping broth was made from what was already there. The cost beyond what had already been spent was effectively nothing. The dripping tin was going to be scraped clean regardless. The vegetable water was going to be poured away regardless. She just didn't pour it away. She made something from it instead. It vanished when the dripping tin vanished, when the permanent pot on the back ring was replaced by a gas cooker that got turned off between meals, when the economics of the kitchen changed just enough that boiling everything together stopped making sense. But dripping broth was just the beginning of what these women could do with almost nothing. The next one took a single ingredient and turned it into a meal that lasted 3 days. Number 24, potato and onion soup. 2 potatoes, 1 onion, water, salt. That is the entire list of ingredients. And in the mining communities of County Durham in 1947, when rationing was still strict and the housekeeping money was 14 shillings and 6pence until Friday, that was dinner. Just the potato and the onion and the water and the salt. The potatoes peeled and cut rough, not neat, not uniform, just cut, into a pot of cold water with the onion quartered and a pinch of salt, and brought to a boil and then left to simmer until everything was soft enough to break apart with the back of a spoon. Some of it mashed against the side of the pot to thicken the liquid, some of it left in pieces, so there was something to eat rather than just something to drink. A knob of dripping stirred through at the end if there was dripping. A slice of bread on the side to dip if there was bread. And if there was neither, just the soup. Just the potato and the onion and the water and the salt, and it was enough. Not comfortable enough, not satisfying enough, but enough. That soup cost roughly 3pence for 4 portions in 1947. It asked almost nothing of the housekeeping money and gave back more than it had any right to. You couldn't sell that recipe today, nobody would buy it. And that tells you everything about the distance between then and now. Number 23, Tripe and Onion Pot. Not the restaurant version. Not the version served with fussy accompaniments in an establishment that charges for the heritage of it. The pot version, a pound of dressed tripe from the butcher, already cleaned and white and slightly translucent, cut into pieces and dropped into a pot with thickly sliced onions, covered with milk and water, half and half, seasoned with salt and white pepper and left to simmer for 2 hours, until the tripe was completely tender and the liquid had reduced into a thin, pale sauce that coated everything in the pot. In the textile towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire in the 1960s, Oldham, Rochdale, Halifax, Huddersfield, tripe was not a curiosity. It was Tuesday. A pound of dressed tripe in 1965 cost around 1 shilling and 4pence. It fed 4 adults. That is 4pence per head for a meal with genuine protein content and enough warmth and substance to see a man through an evening shift. The tripe shops of the north were still open into the 1980s. The last dedicated tripe shop in Bolton closed in 2004, and with it went the specific knowledge of how to cook tripe properly. The timing, the temperature, the ratio of milk to water that existed only in the practice of women who had been making it since before the war. A pound of dressed tripe in 1965 cost around 1 shilling and 4pence. It fed 4 adults. Number 22. Bread and Vegetable Pot, 11 pence for 7. This is the one, 11 pence, 7 people, 1953, Salford, Manchester. Whatever vegetables were cheapest at the market that morning, usually a turnip, 2 carrots, a couple of potatoes, an onion, roughly chopped and put in the pot with water to cover and brought to a simmer. While it simmered, stale bread, the heel of the loaf, the slices gone too hard for anything else, torn into pieces and added to the pot in the last 20 minutes, so it swelled with the vegetable stock and thickened it from the inside. Salt, sometimes a bay leaf if there was one. Sometimes a few dried herbs from a paper twist bought at the market for a halfpenny, and that was everything. A thick, starchy, vegetable-heavy pot that fed 7 people for 11 pence and left the pot clean because there was nothing left. She never called it a recipe, she never called it anything. It was just what she made on the days when that was what there was. And the women who made it, in Salford and Liverpool and Newcastle and Glasgow and Cardiff, never once thought to write it down, which is why it has completely disappeared, and why almost nobody under 60 has ever tasted it. We are still at number 22. The meals get more remarkable from here. Number 21, Oxtail Stew. The sound of it in the pot before you even came downstairs. A low, rolling simmer that had been going since 6 in the morning and would still be going at noon. The smell of it, dark, meaty, slightly gelatinous, in a way that told your nose this was something that had been cooking for a long time and was going to be extraordinary. Oxtail. Pieces of beef tail, jointed by the butcher, browned in a little dripping at the bottom of a heavy pot. Then onion and carrot added and cooked down, then water or stock to cover. Then onion and carrot added and cooked down, then water or stock to cover, then the lid on and the heat reduced to the barest possible simmer, and left for 4 to 5 hours until the meat was falling from the bone and the liquid had reduced into something so thick and rich it was almost a sauce. £1.50 of oxtail in 1967 cost around 2 shillings from the family butcher. It was the cheap cut, the offal-adjacent cut. The cut that posh people didn't buy, and that working-class families made extraordinary through time and patience rather than money. The supermarket ended oxtail as an everyday meal, not because it stopped stocking it. Some supermarkets still carry it. But because the supermarket culture of buying food to eat the same day made the 5-hour simmer feel unreasonable. You can't fit a 5-hour simmer into a modern evening. You could fit it into a 1967 Saturday when the pot went on at 8 and dinner was at 1. The next one also needed time, but the payoff was completely different. Number 20, Peas Pudding Pot. Yellow split peas, soaked overnight in cold water. Drained in the morning and put in the pot with fresh water. A piece of ham knuckle or a bacon hock if the budget stretched. And simmered for 2 hours until the peas had completely collapsed into a thick, dense, golden mass. That was halfway between a soup and a solid, dense enough to eat with a spoon from a bowl, thick enough to slice cold the next day. Peas pudding is one of the oldest foods in Britain. It appears in records going back to medieval times. In the northeast of England, County Durham, Tyneside, Wearside, it was still a standard weekly pot in the 1960s and into the 1970s. The rhyme most people half remember, peas pudding hot, peas pudding cold, peas pudding in the pot 9 days old, is not a nursery rhyme about something historical. It is a description of how this food was actually used. Made on Monday, eaten hot, eaten cold, eaten again the day after that. A pound of dried yellow split peas in 1968 cost around 5 pence. A ham knuckle from the butcher cost around 1 6. The whole pot fed a family of 5 for 2 meals. That is under 5 pence per person per meal. Greggs still sells peas pudding in the northeast. But the home pot, the one made from dried peas soaked overnight, that is gone from almost every British kitchen. We are at number 20. And stop for a moment, because there's something about everything on this list so far that's worth understanding before we go further. Every single pot on this list was built on the same invisible principle: time instead of money, patience instead of ingredients. The longer the simmer, the less the pot needed in it. Oxtail into silk, dried peas into velvet, dripping into a base. These weren't compromises. They were techniques, sophisticated, refined, generations-deep techniques that took the cheapest possible ingredients and extracted from them more flavour and more nourishment than the ingredients appeared to contain. The women who did this every day weren't cooking, they were performing a kind of alchemy, and the alchemy required one thing above everything else that modern kitchens no longer have: time. Uninterrupted time in a kitchen with a pot that stayed on a low heat all morning while she did everything else. When that time disappeared, when women went out to work in larger numbers through the 1960s and 70s, when the workday extended, when the economics of the household changed, the long simmer went with it. And with the long simmer went every single one of these pots. Not because they weren't good enough, because they required something the kitchen could no longer give them. Understanding that changes how you hear the next items on this list. Because from number 19 down, these are the pots that people specifically chose to make. Not because they had to, but because they were that good. Number 19, Lancashire Hot Pot, the real one. Not the pub menu version that arrives in a ramekin, the pot version. A tall, straight-sided clay pot, brown glazed, that had probably belonged to her mother before her, and would belong to her daughter after. Layers of thinly sliced raw potato, alternating with layers of neck of mutton, onion, and carrot, seasoned heavily with salt and white pepper, topped with a final layer of overlapping potato slices brushed with a little dripping, and then into the oven at a low heat, around 300 degrees. For 2.5 to 3 hours until the meat had cooked down into its own gravy, and the potato on top was golden and slightly crisped at the edges. Neck of mutton in 1971 cost around 2 shillings a pound in Lancashire. A hot pot for 5 needed roughly 2 pounds of meat and 4 pounds of potato. Total cost, under 6 shillings for a meal that needed no accompaniment beyond pickled red cabbage on the side. The clay pot. The specific clay pot. If yours was the family that had one, you'll know exactly what I mean. The weight of it, the shape, the fact that it was always slightly damp on the outside, and the smell of it absorbed 50 years of hot pots. That came out when you lifted the lid. That pot tells you something the next item never could. But number 18 comes very close. Number 18. Scouse. Liverpool, 1968. Every street in the terraced rows behind the docks, the same smell coming from every kitchen on a Tuesday. Because Tuesday was Scouse Day, the way Friday was Fish Day, the way Sunday was Roast Day. The rhythms of the week expressed in what was on the stove. Scouse is a stew, but describing it as a stew is like describing the Mersey as a river, technically correct and completely inadequate. Diced neck of lamb or beef skirt, or no meat at all on the weeks when money was really short. In which case you had blind scouse, with potatoes, carrots, onions, swede, in a pot with water and a bay leaf. Simmered for as long as it needed until everything had given up what it had. The name Scouse comes from lobscouse, a sailor's stew brought in by Norwegian and Scandinavian sailors, absorbed into the city's food culture so completely that it became the name for the people themselves. You don't just eat scouse in Liverpool, you are Scouse. That identity piece is the thing that kept it alive longer than almost any other pot on this list. And even now it's mostly made by the older generation. Number 17. Cawl. Wales. The specific, irreplaceable Welsh one-pot meal that has existed in the country's food culture since the 13th century. You can still find it on restaurant menus in Cardiff today, except the restaurant version is not the pot your grandmother made. In a terraced house in Merthyr Tydfil in 1964, and they are not the same thing. Lamb. Neck of Welsh lamb, always neck, always on the bone, simmered with leeks, swede, potato, carrot, parsnip, in a large pot of water that became the broth and then the meal simultaneously. Cooked the previous day, left overnight for the fat to rise and be skimmed, reheated the next day when the flavours had deepened and the broth had a quality it could never have had. In the South Wales valleys in 1965, cawl was made on a Sunday from the cheaper cuts of Welsh Hill lamb. 1.9 for a piece of neck that would make enough cawl for 6 people for 2 days. Nothing wasted. The leftover broth served separately as a soup course before the meat and vegetables. 1 pot, 2 meals. It survived in Wales in a way that similar pots didn't survive elsewhere, because it had a name and identity and national pride attached to it. The unnamed pots that did the same work in England didn't have that protection. We haven't yet reached the pots that people specifically remember by smell. That changes now. Number 16. Rabbit stew. The smell of it first, before you've even named what it is, before you've seen the pot. A sweetness in the steam that isn't quite chicken and isn't quite anything else. Something more delicate than mutton. That's rabbit. Wild rabbit. Caught by the man of the house on a Sunday morning or bought from the butcher for around 1 and 3 in 1963. Jointed at the kitchen table. Browned in dripping in the pot. Onion, carrot, a couple of sticks of celery. Water or stock to cover, a bay leaf, a sprig of thyme from the garden, lid on, low heat, 2 hours. Rabbit was the working-class game meat for centuries. Not because anyone thought of it as game. Game was for people with estates and shooting parties. Rabbit was just the cheap meat that ran in the fields. and could be had for almost nothing if you had the patience to catch it, or the penny or two to buy it from a man who did. Myxomatosis in 1953 devastated the British rabbit population. Rabbits came back, but the habit of eating them never fully recovered, and the supermarket decided rabbit wasn't worth the trouble, which meant one of Britain's oldest meals quietly died. Number 15. Lentil and Bacon Pot. Red lentils. The orange kind. Not green, not brown. The orange ones that cook down to nothing in 45 minutes, a handful of bacon scraps, releasing the smokiness. Then the lentils added, then water, then onion, then a pinch of turmeric which gave it that particular deep yellow-orange colour. This pot was fast. 45 minutes from dry lentils to something thick enough to eat with a spoon and nutritious enough to constitute a proper meal. It was also what you made on the Thursdays when the money was thin. Lentils in 1970 cost around 5p a pound from the co-op. A pound of red lentils fed 4 people. The bacon scraps added flavour for pennies more. We are at number 15. The top 10 are still ahead. Number 11. Cod and Potato Pot. The health visitor's recommendation. Birmingham, 1951. Post-war health visitors making calls to struggling families in the back-to-back houses of Handsworth and Aston, recording in their notebooks the food situations they found. And in several of those notebooks, alongside the recommendations for iron-rich foods and vitamin supplements, a specific reference to a cod and potato pot that local women were making, and that the visitors noted approvingly as providing better nutrition than most of what was available to these families at the price point involved. Salt cod, dried and preserved, bought from the fishmonger for around 6p a portion in 1951, soaked overnight to remove the salt, then broken into the pot with potatoes cut in chunks, onion, a bay leaf, water to cover. Simmered for 45 minutes until the fish had broken down into flakes and the potato had absorbed the fish flavour. And the liquid had become a pale, slightly cloudy broth with a specific saltiness that the overnight soaking hadn't quite removed. Salt cod provided more protein per penny than almost anything else available at that price. The potato added carbohydrate, the onion added vitamins. The health visitors were right. This was an extraordinarily nutritious pot for its cost. It disappeared from British kitchens as fresh fish became more reliably available through the 1960s, and as the specific knowledge of how to work with salt cod stopped being taught because fresh fish didn't require the same preparation. The knowledge went, and with it went the pot. Number 10. Corned beef and potato hash pot. The tin on the table. You knew what was for dinner the moment you saw it. Fray Bentos, the blue and white label. That specific tin with the key soldered to the bottom that you rolled around the lid to open it. The resistance of the metal. The smell that came up when the lid folded back. That was a smell. That was the smell of a specific meal on a specific day of the week. The corned beef broken into a pot with diced potatoes and onion that had been softened in a little dripping. Everything pressed flat, then covered with water. Not much, just enough to come halfway up the sides. Then the lid on, and the heat low, and the whole thing left to steam rather than boil. The potato cooking in the liquid that came off the corned beef as it heated, until you could press everything together into something almost solid. A tin of Fray Bentos corned beef in 1969 cost around 1 shilling and 8p. It made a hash pot that fed 4 people, 4p per head. With bread and pickled beetroot on the side, always pickled beetroot. The jar that lived permanently at the back of the pantry shelf. It was a complete meal that cost the housekeeping money the price of a stamp. Fray Bentos changed their formula in the 1990s. Ask anyone who grew up eating this and they'll tell you, it isn't the same tin. The texture is different. The fat content is different. The hash pot exists. The tin it was built on does not. Number 9. Pig's Trotter and Vegetable Pot. 4 pig's trotters from the butcher. 6p each in 1962, so 2 shillings for 4, placed in a pot of cold water and brought slowly to the boil. And skimmed, then onion, carrot, celery, bay leaf, peppercorns, a good pinch of salt, and simmered for 3 hours until the trotters were completely tender and the liquid had become thick with the gelatin that had cooked out of the skin and bone. The vegetables that cooked with the trotters were eaten alongside them. The broth was served first as a soup. The trotters themselves were eaten with the fingers, because that's the only practical way to eat a trotter. picking the soft, gelatinous meat from around the bone and eating it with vinegar and mustard and bread. It was considered rough food, street food, the kind of thing you ate standing at a market stall rather than sitting at a table. And in the north of England in the 1950s and 60s, that was exactly where you might find it. A tray of trotters in the market, 6pence each. Eaten with your fingers while you did the rest of your shopping. It vanished because the relationship with eating bones and skin and the connective tissue that comes with them changed. Because the generation that grew up eating trotters made sure their children didn't have to. And the children, out of respect for the sacrifice that implied, didn't eat them. And the grandchildren never learned they existed. Number 8. Bacon and Bean Pot. The pot that crossed every regional line. North, South, Midlands, Wales, Scotland. Every working-class kitchen in Britain made some version of this. A piece of collar bacon, the whole piece, not sliced, bought from the butcher for around 1 9 a pound in 1970. Placed in the pot with dried haricot beans that had been soaked overnight, covered with water, brought to a simmer. Onion and carrot added, bay leaf, white pepper, left to cook for 2 to 2.5 hours, until the beans were completely soft and had absorbed the smoky, salty bacon flavour all the way through, and the bacon had cooked down to something tender enough to fall apart with a spoon. The beans thickened the liquid themselves as they cooked. No flour needed, no additional starch, just the slow release of the beans' own starch into the liquid over 2 hours of simmering. She knew that. She didn't know why it happened, but she knew it happened, and she planned around it. A pound of dried haricot beans in 1970 cost around 5pence. The bacon collar was the largest single cost at 1 9 a pound. The whole pot for 6 people cost around 2 and 3pence. That's 4pence halfpenny per person for a meal that was substantial, nutritious, deeply flavoured, and hot. Heinz baked beans on toast replaced the pot. Quicker, cheaper, not the same in any way that mattered. And the distinction between a can of baked beans and a 2-hour bacon and bean pot is the distinction between convenience and cooking, and convenience won definitively and completely by 1980. Number 7. Cock-a-leekie, Scotland. The pot that has the most distinguished lineage of anything on this list. Records of cock-a-leekie appear in Scottish historical sources going back to the 16th century. And that was still being made in working-class Scottish kitchens in the 1960s and 70s as an ordinary weekday meal rather than a heritage dish. A boiling fowl, not a roasting chicken, a boiling fowl, an older bird that had stopped laying and could be had from the butcher or the farm for around 2 and 6 in 1965. Placed in a large pot with leeks, onion, barley, sometimes a few prunes, which sounds strange and isn't, covered with water, and simmered for 3 hours until the tough old bird had given everything it had to the pot and the liquid had become something extraordinary. The boiling fowl is the key ingredient that can no longer be sourced. Modern poultry production doesn't produce older laying birds in the same way or in the same quantities, and the few that do exist don't reach the consumer market. The bird that made cock-a-leekie extraordinary, that bird has effectively disappeared from British retail. And without it, you cannot make the real thing, and the real thing has gone. Number 6. Brown Windsor soup, the home version. Not the version that appeared on Edwardian menus in hotels and dining rooms and became a byword for British culinary conservatism and institutional blandness. The home version, which was not the same thing and should not be confused with it. The home Brown Windsor was a working-class pot that used whatever cheap cuts of beef were available. Shin, skirt, cheek, browned in dripping until dark and almost caramelized, then onion and carrot and swede added and cooked down. Then pearl barley, or rice to thicken, then a bay leaf and white pepper, and sometimes a small amount of mixed herbs, dried, from the paper twist on the pantry shelf. And left to simmer for 2 to 3 hours until the meat was falling apart and the liquid was thick and dark and deeply savoury. It was called Brown Windsor in homes because it was brown, and because Windsor was considered a slightly fancy-sounding name, and calling something Windsor made it feel like slightly less of a poverty meal than it actually was. That little act of renaming, of giving something plain a slightly elevated title, is one of the most human things about working-class British food culture. In the kitchens of working-class southeast England in the 1950s, Kent, Surrey, Sussex, this pot appeared on the stove at least once a week. it has gone from those kitchens almost entirely. Number 5. Eel and Potato Pot, East London, the East End specifically. And if you grew up anywhere near the East End in the 1950s or 60s, you already know exactly what this is. And if you didn't, you are about to understand something important about the food culture of a part of Britain that has been comprehensively written out of its own history. Jellied eels are well known. The eel and potato pot is not. Fresh eels, caught in the Thames, or bought from the eel stall at the market for around 9p a pound in 1961, cut into pieces, placed in a pot with diced potato, onion, parsley, water to cover. Cut into pieces, placed in a pot with diced potato, onion, parsley, water to cover. Simmered for 45 minutes until the eel was cooked through and the potato was soft. And the cooking liquid had turned into a thin broth with a very specific, clean riverfish quality that you either loved completely or found completely impossible. The East End eel trade was still alive into the 1970s. The last Thames eels were caught commercially in the 1960s. Pollution had made the river inhospitable. And after that, the eels came from Ireland and from Holland and eventually stopped coming at all because the economics of supplying a diminishing market made it not worth continuing. The eel and potato pot is gone from London kitchens. The jellied eel stalls survive barely in a few locations. But the home pot, the one the grandmothers made twice a week in the streets behind the market, that is gone as completely as the eel trade that supplied it. Number 4. Potted meat pot, the original, not the pink paste in a jar that still appears on some supermarket shelves. The original, made at home from a piece of pork belly or shin beef, whatever was cheapest, simmered in the pot for 2 to 3 hours, with onion, bay, peppercorns and salt until the meat was completely tender and the liquid had reduced to almost nothing. The meat stripped from the bones and packed tightly into a basin. The reduced cooking liquid, now thick with gelatin, poured over the packed meat and left to set overnight in the cold. The next day it came out of the basin as a firm, dark, sliceable terrine that could be cut and put on bread or eaten with pickles. And that lasted 4 to 5 days in the pantry without any refrigeration because the salt and the gelatin preserved it. In the working-class kitchens of Sheffield and Wakefield and Barnsley in the 1950s, potted meat was made once a week and used across the week, in sandwiches on toast as a supper with bread and pickle. The economics were extraordinary. A piece of pork belly in 1954 cost around 1 shilling a pound. The resulting potted meat fed a family of 5 across 4 days of lunches, under a penny per head per meal. It vanished when refrigeration made preservation less critical, when ready-made paste became available and cheaper in apparent price, though not in nutrition or flavour. And when the 4 hours of simmering required to make it properly became time that nobody could give to a weekday kitchen. Number 3. Stoved Towdy. This one you may not know, and that itself is the point. Towdy is the old Scots word for a young chicken, specifically a chicken not yet laying, a pullet, in the specific language of Scottish farming that existed before the modern poultry industry standardised everything into broiler chickens and made the vocabulary of age and type redundant. Stoved Towdy, the stove being the pot, the long slow cook, was a chicken simmered in the pot with onion, cloves, spinach or kale, sometimes oatmeal to thicken, sometimes barley, in a broth that developed over 2 hours into something rich and deeply Scottish in flavour. In the farming communities of Perthshire and Angus and Fife in the 1950s, stoved Towdy was the Sunday pot when there was a chicken to use. Not a bought chicken, a chicken from the yard that had stopped being useful for eggs and was now useful for the pot. The transition from living animal to Sunday dinner was managed without sentiment because sentiment was something you couldn't afford. That relationship with food, the complete, unsentimental, respectful use of every animal from beak to feet, has almost entirely disappeared from British domestic cooking, and with it has gone the vocabulary that described it, the recipes that used it, and the flavour that came from it. Number 2. Boiled Silverside with dumplings. This is the pot that made the house smell like Sunday, even when it was Wednesday. A piece of salted Silverside, the salt beef that you soaked overnight to remove enough of the brine, placed in the pot with cold water, brought slowly to the boil, skimmed, then root vegetables added, a bay leaf, peppercorns, In the last 45 minutes, suet dumplings. The specific suet dumplings that no other dumpling resembles and no other cooking method produces. Plain flour, shredded sweet, a pinch of salt, rolled into balls, dropped into the simmering broth where they swelled and rose, until they were twice their original size and slightly glossy on the outside and soft and dense inside. Silverside in 1966 cost around 2 and 6pence a pound. A £2 piece with dumplings and vegetables fed 6 people. The dumplings cost almost nothing. Suet was 6pence a packet. Flour was always in the house. The salt beef tradition has survived in Jewish communities. The salt beef sandwich remains a London institution. But the boiled Silverside and dumpling pot, that is gone. The soaking, the slow boil, the dumplings dropped in at the end. The smell, gone. Number 1. The Perpetual Pot. This is the one. The meal eaten by more British working-class families than any other on this list. And it doesn't have a single recipe because it was never the same twice. The Perpetual Pot was exactly what the name says. A pot that was never empty, never completely emptied and refilled, just topped up. Every day, whatever was in the pot from the day before formed the base of what went in today. Leftover vegetables, a bone from Sunday's roast, the water the potatoes had boiled in, bread that had gone hard, a few lentils, a scrape of dripping. In the mining communities of South Wales, in the textile towns of Lancashire, in the back streets of the northeast, the Perpetual Pot sat on the range, and was never quite the same on any 2 days, because what went into it depended on what that day had left behind. Monday, it was thin. Tuesday, it was slightly richer. The Monday's bones had given something to the liquid. Wednesday, it had depth. Thursday, it was at its best. 4 days of accumulation had made something you couldn't have made deliberately. Friday, she cleared it and started again. This pot had no name, no recipe, no book entry. It existed only in the practice of millions of women in millions of kitchens across working-class Britain, from roughly the 1880s through to the 1960s, when the gas cooker replaced the range and the economics and logistics of keeping something permanently simmering became impractical. The Perpetual Pot required the range that never went out, the fire that was banked up at night and stoked up in the morning, the constant, uninterrupted heat source that kept the pot going without any decision or effort being required. When the range went, the Perpetual Pot went with it. And what went with the Perpetual Pot was the entire philosophy of cooking that it represented. The philosophy that nothing is finished, nothing is wasted, everything continues into the next thing. Your grandmother knew this without being told. She'd learned it from her mother. Her mother had learned it from hers. And somewhere in the chain between her and you, it stopped. That's what's been lost, not a recipe. A way of thinking about food that would look to a modern kitchen like nothing at all. And that was, in practice, the most sophisticated cooking philosophy Britain ever produced. If your grandmother had a pot that was always on, leave it in the comments. Tell us what she called it. Because those pots and the women who kept them going deserve to be remembered somewhere permanent.